what are you going to say? What are you going to value these? And we got these very peculiar things. Some people value them at 50 cents on the dollar, some on 70, some on 20. And no one was prepared to actually admit how worthless these huge group of what we then called toxic securities were. But Britain now had a rather unusual situation in the beginning of the crisis, which I think shaped perception in Britain quite differently from how this developed in the US. The first difference in Britain was that unlike the European Central Bank and unlike the Fed, the Bank of England didn't actually believe this crisis was as serious, or that the British banks were going to be as vulnerable as banks in Europe and America. So the Bank of England was the only bank that didn't pour hundreds of billions into the financial markets at the first stage in August. And the governor of the Bank of England, who had been actually early in warning about the crisis, believed the argument about moral hazard, that the banks had ignored his warnings. Now, rather than pour money to save them, we should show them how bad it is if they ignore the warnings of the governor of the Bank of England. The consequence, one of the consequences of that, is it immediately became clear that some of the UK banks were in serious trouble because they had been funding their mortgage lending operations essentially by borrowing on these wholesale markets, this residential mortgage-backed securities. And without access to that money, they're going to have great difficulty continuing their operations. The biggest buyer of those residential mortgage-backed securities by proportion was a bank called Northern Rock, which some of you may know in Britain there were things called building societies, which were originally set up by workers to start to help themselves buy homes. They became quite large operations, and in the 1990s, they were demutualized and turned into stock market companies. All the shareholders were very happy. They all got a few £100, a few $100 out of the demutualization. It didn't seem to have any risk. But some of them then decided we could really become kind of go-go banks. And the leading one of that was a small building society in the north of England based in Newcastle called Northern Rock. They decided that they would go very aggressively into expanding their mortgage lending, offering 125% mortgages. That is, you could get a mortgage for more than the value of your house on the grounds that the value of your house would just keep going up. And also, they went very big into what was called the buy-to-let market, i.e. funding people to buy a second house other than the one they already owned on the grounds you could rent it out. The rent was going to cover all your costs of the mortgage, and you would make money because the house would keep going up in value, and you could sell it later. So about 10% of mortgages in the UK were turned into these buy-to-let mortgages. From nothing, it went to sort of a rather large number. Now, so Northern Rock had moved to being the third largest mortgage lender in the UK with about 20% of the whole market by this stage. In August 2007, they went to the Bank of England and said, we're in serious trouble. Now, as you, again, you know, with the Labour government, who had been in charge since '97, was very much new Labour. They didn't really believe that the old idea of state intervention, particularly nationalization, was a good idea. They had explicitly rejected that, and that had been the basis of their electoral success. So they were very reluctant to have a state bailout of Northern Rock. What they were trying to do was to get one of the big clearing banks, Lloyds Bank, to buy Northern Rock. So for about a month, we were aware of these kind of secret negotiations going on with Lloyds, TSB, who wanted to buy Northern Rock to get their mortgage business, but were aware of their problems with the bits of those residential mortgage-backed securities they couldn't fund, and asked the government to guarantee them to the extent of something like $50 billion, 30 billion pounds. And there was a huge debate between the Bank of England and the Treasury about whether to do this and whether it was necessary to do this. And eventually, Lloyd said, okay, we're not going to do that. And unless you can guarantee it, we're pulling out of the negotiations. And this is what then caused the crisis. Essentially, we learned at the BBC that this was happening, that these negotiations had broken down, and that essentially the Bank of England was going to have to come in as lender of last resort and guarantee that Northern Rock would not go bust. The Bank of England was very much didn't want us to say anything about this while this was still going on. But we did go to air. Robert Peston, our business editor, wrote a blog, went on air at 10 o'clock on Thursday night, the 13th of September, saying, the Bank of England is going to rescue Northern Rock. Don't worry, your money is safe, but it is going to be a pretty big shock to the financial system. It's the first bank that's having to be rescued in Britain since 1895, Barings Brothers, and it's not a good sign for the UK financial system. The result of this, though, was, here are the pictures, millions of investors in Northern Rock who hadn't experienced a bank run, no one had in Britain in living memory, going to the bank, ringing the bank, trying to go on the bank's website to find out what was happening and whether their money was safe. And it turned out, of course, their money wasn't as safe as all that, because the deposit protection scheme in Britain only protected the first £35,000 of your money, and it only protected 90% of it. Not many people knew that when they started asking these questions. And it also turned out, because it has been very much a local bank, a lot of people in Northern Rock had put all their savings, much more than $35,000, in this bank on the grounds it was safe. So there were huge queues formed in front of this bank. Panic. Now, eventually, the result of our report and the result of these, a weekend in which, there was complete panic, was that the Chancellor, Alistair Darling, was forced to go on television on Monday night after 3 days of panic and say, the UK government now guarantees all depositors in Northern Rock, and by implicitly all depositors in all UK retail banks, that you will never lose any money from a bank run. So the government was forced to essentially guaranteeing all £900 billion, £1.8 trillion worth of deposits in the UK banking system, which they hadn't been planning to do, and they weren't particularly happy with having to do. But they were forced to do it by the fact this bank run was making the whole UK banking system look incredibly vulnerable. Now, this, I think, set a different tone in Britain for the coverage. Obviously, the first thing was we were heavily criticized for saying anything about this crisis in advance of the official announcement, and in some quarters, particularly the Bank of England, blamed for the crisis. In fact, the Bank of England proposed legislation which would ban journalists from discussing any secret negotiations in any future crisis as part of their new banking bill. It also showed that, obviously, people weren't aware of, the vulnerability of the deposit scheme, weren't aware of how vulnerable the banking system was, and became, were highly sensitive to these reports. So in a sense, here the media was actually an actor in the first stage of the crisis, not just an observer. Now, the other thing that this phase of the crisis brought out was the fact that the dysfunctional nature of the response in the UK on the policy front, at least initially, was that there was a three-part system that was supposed to be regulating the banking system in the UK. The government, that is the Treasury, the Bank of England, and the Financial Services Agency, which was the regulator. And what this whole crisis made clear, and still hasn't been really resolved, was these three agencies weren't working together.
I just wanted to jump in here with a memory from the BBC coverage from Northern Rock, where a BBC correspondent was outside the bank and everyone was queuing up. And the correspondent said to this woman, said, "Madam, haven't you heard that the Bank of England is guaranteeing all the deposits in the bank? Why are you out here?" And she said, "Yes, and I also heard that the captain of the Titanic would get to New York quickly," and was the response.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there was an incredible amount of mistrust, again, with the government. But one of the features we saw then was that the mistrust not just between the public and the government, but the mistrust between the different sections of government was quite important in this. And this is one reason why, I mean, in the US, Bernanke and Paulson tried to keep a common front. In Britain, we've had, even now, as you know, a lack of a common front. The Bank of England is attacking the government's plans even now and saying they should go further. And we had this sort of open debate and open warfare between, the key people running things. And obviously, that made for interesting coverage, also made for probably, the public being even more worried. Now, I mean, the other things you have to say about the early stage of this crisis in the UK was it did mean the UK started thinking about the policy implications before anyone else.